Okay, now we're ready. How much coffee do you have? Yes. All right, so at the time of recording, this was the state of things. So here we are. And for those of you who voted for subplots, that guy's going to be next. He's in the works, cooking, etc. Character arcs. I tell you, I love a good arc. Typically, when I'm at any kind of social function and I've got someone cornered and at my mercy while I talk their ear off about whatever my current thing is, it's almost always a character arc that I'm talking about. I spent a really embarrassing amount of time trying to figure out the best way to actually present this video. The concept of character arcs is both very simple and very complex. Simple because the ideas are actually quite straightforward. Complex because there's so much variation in there that studying it can get a little overwhelming. I couldn't help but notice that closely examining one character arc seemed to neglect a lot of important knowledge that one could glean by looking at other character arcs. As much as I would love to sit here for the next 6 or 7 hours and talk about all my favorite character arcs, one does need to, eat and sleep and stuff. I do want to get this out of the way first. Not all characters need arcs. I know that somewhat flies in the face of conventional wisdom, but they aren't always essential, not even for your main characters. A big reason for this confusion is that a lot of people conflate dynamic characters with changing characters. You absolutely must have dynamic characters, but that's not always going to necessitate an arc. I'll explain that in a minute, but we're getting a little ahead of ourselves. I want to get this out of the way too. Sometimes a common name is misleading. A character's development is actually very rarely in an arc shape. Sometimes it's like this, or even like this. But arc is a helpful name, so that's fine. For convenience, in this video, I'll refer to the gradual transformation of a character throughout the story as the character's development arc. To start with, what precisely is a character arc or character development arc? Well, there isn't really a precise answer. Broadly speaking, a development arc is a character's dynamic transformation throughout the course of the story. Nothing more, nothing less. I like this definition because there's a lot of room for variance in there. The transformation part of that is what indicates that the character is changing in the course of their development. Now, there's that word again, dynamic. That's important. Dynamic very simply just means motion, not necessarily constant change, but constant motion. So a character, being a living person, will experience constant internal motion. This can be psychological or emotional or moral. Even if a person doesn't change, their lack of change is still accomplished by constantly moving back to their original state. They go along in life, something happens, it jostles them around, and they decide to return to status quo. This is still accomplished with constant action, which gives you, in fancy terms, dynamic characters. So even if your characters are very dynamic, that doesn't mean they're going to have an arc of transformation or anything like that. And that's fine. Let's just get this out of the way here and now. You can choose to have no character transformation arc at all, but you can't choose to have characters who aren't dynamic. That's mandatory, I'm afraid. This is why I don't really like that term flat character arc, because even if a character never changes, there's still constant motion along their character path, without which the character would seem like a flat piece of cardboard. So just remember that character development's optional. Dynamic characters, mandatory. Or to use different terms, change, optional. Constant motion, mandatory. Now that that's out of the way, let's get back to development arcs. What kinds of development arcs are there? Truly, any kind of transformation is suitable for an arc and is considered a development arc. And also any amount of transformation. It doesn't have to be dramatic to be an arc. Early versions of this video had about 10 extra minutes examining some 15 or so different character arcs to demonstrate the breadth of what's possible. But I decided to instead focus on how to build a development arc rather than what arcs can be built. Because the long and short of all this is that there are as many types of character development arcs as there are characters. Which one you choose or whether you even use one at all depends entirely on the character you're creating and the story you're writing. Don't get caught up in thinking about fitting your story into types of development arcs. Instead, think of where you want your character to start and where you want them to end, and then find a good way to get them from point A to point B. This list, for example, claims to list every type of character arc. Off the top of my head, I can think of 6 or 7 character arcs from fiction that I really enjoyed that did not fit into the categories listed here. Had those writers relied on this list of types or even the concept of types of character arcs, those beautiful stories likely would never have been written. So keep this in the back of your mind. There are no types of development arcs. Whatever transformation you want your character to undergo, the only limit is your imagination. You can have a character become a smart, noble leader while declining physically, only to eventually slip into tyranny and become a villain, after which he attempts to redeem himself while also trying to heal his physical ailments. I mean, that'd be a long story, but it'd be incredible as well. I've seen a series in which the main character becomes rapidly more intelligent while also becoming morally more selfish and heartless. And then he shifts and starts to become a very good person, all the while his mental abilities increase exponentially until ultimately they decline so sharply that he became like a young child, thus concluding his character arc almost back where he had begun. Anything is possible. It only matters that you build the development arc correctly. Once again, the big question here is how? How do you transform a character in a way that's believable, realistic, and even meaningful? How do you plan such a transformation in advance? How do you build the arc? A point to mention. Some of this will make a little more sense to you if you've seen my character creation video. That will help guide you through the initial building of characters. And the building blocks that you use for that are also going to be used to craft characters' arcs. Structurally, I also talk a bit about mini arcs, so if that idea is unfamiliar to you, I also talk about that in my pacing video. But it is pretty self-explanatory as we go along. As for how, the technique is deceptively simple. You pick the character's starting point, you decide where you want them to end, and then you determine how you want them to get there. Sounds easy and hard, and it is a little of both, but let's see if we can't demystify the process a little. This is bad. We're already on the second cup. So the first, let's call it a principle of character arcs is you need to choose both where the character starts and where you want them to end before you plan their development. As tempting as it often is to let our characters tell us who they are, do remember that you are the boss. Exercising your absolute dictatorial authority over your story and its many components is often the only way to keep things from spiraling entirely out of control. In few other areas is this as important as in character creation. They're people to us naturally, but we're still in charge. And being in charge means making calculated decisions. If you want to give your character an arc, start by knowing first who they are at the beginning, and then decide who you want them to be at the end. If you want your character to start as a proud, respected king or statesman of some kind, that's great. Now, who do you want him to be at the end of the story? Maybe you want the story to follow his decline, in which case you need to decide specifically what that decline will entail. Is he going to be defeated in a battle, in a foolish war of his own making? Is he going to devolve into paranoia and suspicion, executing all his friends and allies until only his enemies remain? Maybe you want him to end up as a happy farmer somewhere with no authority but with a lovely wife who weaves baskets. Whatever you want, just make a decision. Now you have point A and point B. Once you have these 2 points, you're halfway to creating his arc. But first, you must remember this next principle. The seeds of your character's final form, so to speak, must always be present in their initial form. That is to say, once you know where you want them to go, how you want the character to end developmentally, you need to make sure that the seeds of that are present in the character traits that make up their initial form, which will be what you decide for them when you're creating their character sheet. Let me explain this more clearly. If you have a character who is ultimately going to become a noble hero and leader, he might start as a humble shepherd in the middle of nowhere. But that humble shepherd must have in him the seeds of the hero and leader. And I'm not speaking in some metaphorical self-help seminar kind of way. I mean that the character traits he starts with have to have in them the beginnings of that final form you want him to achieve. These seeds can exist in many forms depending on how you want him to travel the arc path from point A to point B. In the case of our shepherd, perhaps it's courage and selflessness. Maybe he's clever and strategic. Maybe he's ambitious and good with people. So as a humble shepherd, maybe he's the guy in the village that everyone always goes to when they need a dispute resolved. Maybe he's the guy they wake up in the middle of the night when the bandits are coming. Maybe he's just really good at keeping the peace between his siblings, and so on and so on. And this trait evolves to a capacity for peacekeeping and diplomacy even as the stakes get higher and higher on the path of his arc. This was accomplished beautifully in Guy Ritchie's unsung 2017 King Arthur film. He knew that he wanted to take his Arthur from a humble upbringing as a bastard in a brothel to become the king of all England. His traits at the very beginning included ambition, shrewd people skills, charm and charisma, and a genuine loyalty to the people under his protection. Even a casual observer can see how these traits are the beginning of his final form as a king, not just a king, but a good king. I feel like this concept is still just a tiny bit abstract, so let's try to explain this with a more in-depth example. I deliberately chose an almost exaggeratedly dramatic transformation here with the character of Bai Choufei from the 2022 Chinese martial arts series, Heroes. This is a kind of Shakespearean tragedy following three sworn brothers' evolution into heroes on the very brink of greatness, and then their sharp fall from power and grace within the martial arts world. Bai Choufei began as a noble, upright hero and transformed into a terrifying villain, and then finally a tragic, broken man who didn't know how to redeem himself. Because it was so organic and believable, I found this arc very interesting, and so I studied it and found some wonderful insight into the process. Now, Bai Choufei's writers started him as a hero to some degree, and chose to take his development to a point where he would become a particularly brutal villain. Point A, point B. We are not looking at the path right now, but we do want to look closer at his character's starting point here when he was a hero. Doing so, we find that the seeds of the villain were there among his character traits from the very beginning. Let's take a quick moment here to break him down so you can see what I mean specifically. For the record, I particularly like this example because it's very complex and very elegant. The story of Heroes wasn't quite what it could have been, but I found all the characters exceptionally drawn and worth studying. He started as a very lonely man whose loss of his family was a formative part of his personality. This, in turn, created a major defining trait in him that placed family above everything else. He was also very ambitious. In terms of martial ability, he was strong and capable, among the best in the world. Because of how much he valued the bonds of family, he was very loyal to his friends. This loyalty was more of a sub-trait that stemmed from this other dominant trait here. He had another dominant trait that took a little while to be revealed to the audience. He knew his strength was largely unmatched, so he believed that his power in that regard gave him the right to determine what was right and wrong, a kind of hardline ends justify the means mentality. This trait of his had been forged from having grown up entirely alone with no one to guide him or teach him right from wrong. He observed that the strong took from the weak and resolved to be one of the strong. Not so he could take from the weak, but so nothing could be taken from him. Right and wrong had always been a matter of his own judgment. Remember, what we're looking at here is how the seeds of this dramatic and impressive transformation were all present in his initial form. This was a man who started out saving innocent civilians in distress and became a person who had children put to death. How could that latter form possibly be present in that starting form? Let me show you. His heroism was achieved by combining his loyalty and strength with his willingness to be influenced by his friends. His two sworn brothers were very good and had very solid moral cores. Because the importance he placed on family was the strongest of all his traits, he was willing to defer his own moral judgment to them. He would throw his strength behind whatever they said was right or wrong, and that made him happy because of how much he longed for family. This kept him and his heroism stable for a long time. His villainy was hidden away right here, in his ambition and in his sense that might makes right, and the ends justify the means. These are the seeds of what he would become. He wasn't a villain initially because his dominant trait was being influenced onto a good path. That is, these things combined motivated him to stay good. Sometimes the seeds of the villain would sprout little seedlings, like when he'd sacrifice innocent people to capture a murderer. And then his brothers would come and stomp on those seedlings and he'd get pulled back onto the path of righteousness. Eventually, one of his brothers died, and the other was forced to abandon him to be tortured to death in the enemy's dungeon. And with that, The hero in him lost its roots and withered, leaving a gaping void in his personality, and leaving only these final prominent character traits of ambition and that tendency of his to believe that might makes right. These two traits could now blossom unchecked into horrible malformations. Now this, plus the pain of loss and abandonment and other factors, transformed this once hero into one of the most horrific villains in the entire story. If I've explained this well enough, hopefully you can see that the seeds of the writer's desired transformation of the character were deliberately written into his starting point in order that the transformation that they wanted to create could be realistic and organic. All they had to do was create a story plot that would allow this transformation to take place. We'll get into how to do that in a minute here. Plot and character development must serve each other. What I mean by this is that the goal of your plot, so the overall story goal, needs to in some way be relevant to your goal for the character's development, or vice versa. This is a little harder to explain. Basically, what you want to do is make sure that the plot and the character's development are relevant to each other. If a character needs to learn how to pole vault, then it follows that a pole vaulting competition of some kind needs to be built into the plot. A little more abstractly, if your character needs to learn to be a responsible husband, then the plot needs to give him ways to either be responsible or shirk responsibility. If the plot never challenges that specific aspect of his character that you're trying to develop, you'll never have a chance to build a development arc. Another aspect of that, if you want to make your character grow and transform into a better person throughout the story, then that character can't start in a state of perfection with nothing to learn and no way to grow. They have to start less mature, less intelligent, less cool even than you want them to end up. You have to be willing to give them a chance to grow if the plot demands growth. Give your audience a chance to look at your character and say, oof, that guy's got a long way to go. If you want your character to go from a timid coward to a brave heroine, you'll need to build into the plot instances in which her courage is tested. That's the kind of plot you're going to need. And you have to be willing to let her fail in the course of that plot so that she can learn and so that your audience can understand the difficulty involved in her transformation. The plot's path has to include the stepping stones that your character will need to proceed along their development path. If this feels a little constricting, try to remember that that's actually a good thing. If you set for yourself a goal to build a specific path, then focusing on that path alone is going to result in a very focused and structurally solid story. So some self-imposed restriction is a good thing. All of character development is a series of choices. I didn't really mean for that to sound quite so philosophical. That said, this principle is the secret to making all characters dynamic. Not to oversimplify things, but so much of character development is watching people make choices. And it's interesting because by it, you can watch a person, fictional in this case, evolve before your very eyes. Every development arc is built out of a series of choices. You take a character along the plot path and you present them with choices having to do with the progression of the plot. Their decisions in these moments are what constitutes the path of their development arc. In order to change, even if it's just a small change, a person must make a choice. Even if they stay the same, it is a choice for them to do so. This choice represents motion, inner motion in this case, which is what I was saying about characters being dynamic. So if you make every aspect of their character a choice, the character will always seem dynamic and alive. A writer should write this into the development arc in a way that's very clear and tangible to the audience. That is, make the choice aspect very clear. It's common to see this exaggerated, which is also fine. The point is to emphasize that every point along their development hinges on a choice that the character must make, and also make that choice clear and interesting to the audience. This doesn't just make the characters feel more real and their development feel more organic, it is yet another way to make a story more engaging. This time, however, the engagement is deeper even than what will happen next, and gets into who is this person going to become. Now, structurally, using a series of choices to plot a development arc is going to give you these handy little brackets or anchors that will connect your development arc to your plot. Think of it this way. A character's development arc has a beginning and an end. Yes, just like a story arc does. And with a story arc, this vast, overwhelming middle ground can be built and structured using mini arcs. But what about the character? Just as you place these mini arcs as kind of plot stations that you gradually traverse through one at a time, in a development arc you will be placing points of choice. But as the character makes a choice, a point is placed along their path. These points then connect into a development arc. Almost always, I would even say always, these choice points will occur at the same time as plot mini arcs, mini climaxes. In fact, very often, though not always, that choice that the character makes is the mini climax. In Gladiator, when Commodus learned that his father had chosen Maximus as his heir and not him, he had a choice between accepting his father's decision or fighting it. He chose, in that moment, to kill his father, which was the startling mini-climax that concluded that mini-arc, and also gave us the therefore that moved us into the next mini-arc. Commodus killed his father, therefore Commodus will become emperor, and also, more immediately, he will kill Maximus to silence him. All because he made a choice. From a character development standpoint, this choice represented the first major step along Commodus's path to becoming the unhinged tyrannical villain that was his destined end. Later, when he had to choose between his own will, killing Maximus in the arena, and giving in to the will of the people who wanted him to live, he chose to give in to the people. This was another mini-climax in the plot's path, whether the thumb went up or down. Commodus's choice determined what the mini-climax was, leading to the therefore of Maximus living through the day and growing in popularity. But it was also another point of choice along Commodus's development arc. As far as he was concerned, this was a failure for him, taking a step farther away from the strong, ruthless leader he wanted to become. But from a writing standpoint, this moved closer to unraveling him, as his constant humiliating defeats by Maximus were a major motivating factor for him. All of this from one choice. Choices are powerful tools in writing. They can build plots and develop characters at the same time. Is your character a coward whose development end point will be a brave hero? Then at the first point in your plot, when he's faced with a chance to be brave, make him choose. Maybe this time he fails and hides in fear. That represents a point of choice on his arc, and it means he's either stayed where he is or possibly gotten a little worse. His choice to hide and not be brave has also informed the plot. This moment of decision came at the same moment as a mini-arc's mini-climax, so his choice will create a therefore that will lead to the next plot mini-arc, which will also in turn lead the character to another opportunity to either be brave or be cowardly, thus another point of choice along his arc. String together enough of these and you've got yourself a development arc. All characters, especially main characters, need to be making choices throughout the story. An unchanged character still makes choices, but the difference in this case is that those choices have not been crafted by the writer with the express purpose of developing the character, but only the plot, while also illuminating the character to the audience. In the case of Jeremy Renner's character in The Bourne Legacy, for example, his character was fixed throughout the story. He had no development arc, but the plot was built around choices made by him and by Marta Shearing, who did have a development arc. But his choices had to do only with the plot's development. They involved his own character traits and motivations, which were the same from the moment we met him until the credits rolled, but they only moved the plot forward. Choices are only one half of the tool set used to build a character's development arc. The other half is the character's existing traits as you, the writer, have defined them, preferably with a detailed character sheet. We started talking about this earlier when I mentioned that the seeds of the character's final form must exist in their starting traits. Now let's take that a step further. When you're crafting your character's arc and you're determining the choices they make along the way, these choices have to be informed by a combination of their existing traits and the events of the plot. But the most crucial factor is their existing traits. So when you decide what choice you want a character to make at a given point, you have to make that determination based on that character's traits. If you fail to do this and just make the choice at random, or make the choice that seems to best suit the plot at the moment, the character will lack consistency and the development arc will come out feeling contrived and unrealistic. Alright, so let's go ahead and take what we've talked about to create a demonstration character arc. I don't think we need a story premise to do this for this demonstration, so let's just jump in. But we need a person. So Okay, all right, I know. I've been up to my eyeballs in the historical records of a lot of ancient monarchies, so I've kind of got royalty on the brain. So how about we make ourselves a prince? But let's put him in a modern absolute monarchy, like Kings. Do you remember Kings? Wow, what a great series. Anyway, our prince. So his father is the aged king. So he's a little older, maybe in his 40s. The first thing we need to do is figure out where he starts and where I want him to end. But I want to throw together a simple character sheet to get him off the ground. Let's see. I want to make him start politically clueless and easily controlled and manipulated. Let's call that naive. He's also eager to please people, especially people he loves or admires. He wants his father's approval and praise. He wants to be admired, but he's not ambitious. He really cares about his family, but he doesn't really think about the common people. This doesn't quite make him selfish, but maybe too narrowly focused. Whatever, you understand. He's also very genuine and sincere. To add a little color, let's say he's afraid of his enormously powerful and commanding father and loves him, but his familial attachment is to his maternal uncle, who is strong and powerful but doting. This guy has provided a substitute for a father's love. He's also the one who's been teaching him about ruling. Obviously, I'm building this uncle into a manipulative villain. So all that combined is his starting point. But how do I want my prince to end? Maybe I'll make him an astronaut. I'm not going to make him an astronaut. Although, you know, that'd be a cool story. Obviously, I want my prince to be king, but I want him to take a circuitous route. I like less direct development arcs personally. So I want to take him on a path that looks more like this. I want him to slip maybe ankle deep into villainy and then pull himself back onto the right path to ultimately become a very good, if somewhat ruthless king, but certainly a wiser king. I love doing this. It's like a challenge. You plop yourself into the center of a maze and you have to find your path out, drawing the map along the way. I've done my first and second step. I've built my character sheet. If I were writing this guy for real, or if I had more time, I'd make this character sheet a lot more detailed, but we'll keep it simple like this for now. And I've decided my character's starting point and ending point. What now? In these early development stages of characters and stories, I personally find it more helpful to plan them concurrently. Not everyone will want to work that way. Maybe you'll want to plan your character arc in detail and then build your story around it, or maybe the other way around. If one of those methods works for you, stick with it. We all approach storytelling based on how our minds work, so what works for me might not work for you. But me, personally, at this point, I like to think in my initial broad strokes, encompassing both character and story. I want my naive prince to descend a little into darkness. His uncle, my appointed villain, will help with that. So his uncle will manipulate him into making ugly choices that hurt both his father and the people. This awareness that his decisions have caused harm while increasing his and his uncle's power will awaken in him a dormant trait that will help him begin to form a moral code. His desire to protect his family will expand, and he'll also want to protect his people. His harsh lessons at the feet of his uncle, whose true colors will be revealed, will teach him that a certain amount of ruthlessness will be necessary to shore up the power he needs to protect both his family and his people. Because, you know, he's probably going to end up having to kill his uncle at some point. And that's going to be both a choice and a very hard lesson that will catalyze this aspect of his development, this ruthlessness. This is enough knowledge for me to start. Beyond this broad blueprint, I'd prefer the rest of his development to occur organically, that is, with the progression of the plot. That said, I do want to keep his development in mind as I plan the plot. So what I'll do is keep this blueprint nearby in his character sheet and have it next to me as I plan and build the structure of my story. As the plot moves along, each mini arc will reach a mini climax, and many of them will involve choices that he will have to make. I want to aim these arcs and these choices towards my final goal for him. As an example, as I plan a mini arc in which the evil villain uncle organizes a plan whereby a powerful family will be framed for treason and executed so that the uncle can kind of absorb all their assets and lands, I could just make this a mini climax to the mini arc, with my prince looking on as his uncle arranges the sequence of events to reach this horrifying conclusion. The story would proceed very nicely if I did that, but his development arc wouldn't. It would remain stagnant, and his character, which needs to be dynamic, would remain passive. always a bad thing. Because I need to develop my prince's character, I want to make this plot development into a choice he has to make. As we build this choice, we need to keep an eye on the character traits to remember to keep our prince consistent. I'm not sure at what point this mini arc happens in the story, but let's say this is the latest and the largest in a series of increasingly brazen and villainous developments that the uncle has masterminded. So by now, let's say the prince has lost the rose-colored glasses. He's seeing his uncle as less of a noble hero, but he still doesn't realize that he's just a villain who's using him. Nevertheless, his uncle still finds a way to frame this choice to eliminate this powerful, innocent family as something the prince needs to do for his family and his own power. He manipulates the prince into thinking that this family's existence threatens his own family's existence. He's naive, so he buys that. But the idea that the whole family has to be killed doesn't sit well with him. But the uncle says, you know, leave one alive and you create an enemy or whatever. There's also a part of him that knows that his father wouldn't approve of this decision. But he also really wants to protect his father and the rest of his royal family. At this point in his development, that has become a lot more important to him. So in the end, he makes the choice to execute the whole family. He decides in this moment to sacrifice his father's approval in order to save his father's life. This represents evolution that we can use. He's willing to put the lives of his loved ones, and later his people, before his reputation of being loved himself. That will be a seed for his future shift into nobility and righteousness. Even though in this moment he is taking a step away from my ultimate goal for him. But I want his development to be imperfect. I want him to make mistakes, and given the changes I have in mind for him and the high stakes of the story, some of those mistakes will have to be huge. As a person rooting for this character, I don't like that he makes this decision, but it's good for his character development as I've planned it. This mini climax occurs with his choice. His development evolves with his choice. And so we move into the next mini arc. And if you continue like this, making your considerations for the plot's development include keeping an eye on his character's development, you'll be able to find and plan these points where you can use the plot to present him with these fantastically useful choices. Use these to build his arc according to the blueprint you've set out. That should about wrap up our introduction to character arcs. And I do regard this as an introduction. There's a lot of information here and it's pretty dense, but hopefully I was able to explain this clearly. If you have questions about anything I've talked about here today, drop them in the comment section and I'll do my best to answer them. For your homework. Okay. First of all, on the subject of homework, I have set up a system by which I can look at homework if you decide to do the homework. I spent a while trying to figure this out, so we're still in the trial period of this and might theoretically have some kinks to iron out, but for now, here's what I've come up with. I've set up a Patreon. The link is in the description. And while yes, I'll have 1 or 2 tiers and all that fun stuff, I didn't want to build homework into that tier subscription service, mainly because I don't always stick to a perfect once a month schedule with my videos. And also, you might not always want to do the homework. And I'm not your mom, and this isn't 10th grade. So we should keep this as non-high school as humanly possible. So homework is a small one-time purchase, which you can find here. There's no need to be a Patreon subscriber to purchase a round of homework. Also, you can purchase as many rounds as you like, and you can do whichever homework you like, no matter what my current video is. The homework listings on Patreon, for now anyway, and this is part of the experiment, will be each individual homework. So this video's homework is its own item, and the Helen homework from my character creation video is its own item, and so on and so on. With the purchase of 1 round of homework, you will be able to send me your homework. I will look at it and write up my notes on it and send it back. And then you also get this 1 round of follow-up questions. So if you have questions about my notes on your homework, I will answer 1 round of those questions. However, if you have further questions after that, or you want to do the whole exercise all over again, you need to purchase that homework again. You're welcome to do that as often as you want. But looking at homework, making the notes, etc., that does take me some time. I have no idea how long I'll need to turn around your homework. We're going to learn those kinds of details together. So anyway, for the homework, you can use my prince as I started him, his starting point, his initial form, and then decide a different ending point for him. Determine what points in his initial character traits will inform that ending. Write out the broad idea of his development path, and then I want you to choose no fewer than 3 major points where he will make a choice that will be a mini arc's mini climax, and that will also develop his character along the path that you have chosen for him, and write out summaries of those. You should try to do this chronologically. It can be 3 in direct succession, but it can also be 3 at various points in his development. You can do more than 3 for yourself, but I might not have time to look at more than 3. Anyway, I should probably go get more coffee. As always, thank you so much for watching, and happy writing.